The bitter Wyoming wind cut across the snow-covered plains as Jane Foster pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, squinting through the swirling white that threatened to bury her wagon tracks behind her. It was 1878, and the December blizzard had descended faster than anyone in Sweetwater had predicted, certainly faster than she had anticipated when she'd set out that morning to deliver medicines to the MacPherson homestead, 3 miles outside of town. Jane urged her horses forward, the wagon creaking beneath her as she peered anxiously ahead. She'd completed her delivery, but the return journey was proving treacherous. At 24, she'd lived in the Wyoming Territory long enough to respect the deadly nature of winter storms, yet not so long that she'd learned the wisdom of postponing errands when dark clouds gathered on the horizon. "Just a bit further," she encouraged her team, though her voice was swallowed by the howling wind. The horses trudged forward, their breaths forming cloudy plumes in the frigid air. Through the curtain of white, Jane spotted something that made her heart skip movement where there shouldn't be any. She squinted, certain her eyes were playing tricks. But no, there they were, 2 small figures huddled together, half buried in snow beside what looked like an overturned sleigh. "Whoa," she called to her horses, pulling the reins tight. Jane tied them securely and grabbed her medical bag before jumping down into the knee-deep snow. She trudged forward, the wind slapping her face as she approached the figures. 2 children, a boy and a girl, couldn't have been more than 6 and 4, respectively. Their faces were red with cold, tears frozen on their cheeks. "Heavens above," Jane gasped, kneeling beside them. "What are you doing out here alone?" the boy, trying to appear brave despite his chattering teeth, answered. "Pa's horse got spooked. Sleigh tipped. Pa hit his head. He told us to stay while he went for help." "How long ago?" Jane asked, already wrapping her scarf around the little girl whose lips had taken on a bluish tint. "Don't know," the boy replied. "Before the snow got bad." Jane's heart sank. The storm had been raging for nearly 2 hours. Any man on foot in this weather injured, no less was in grave danger, as were these children if they remained exposed much longer. "I'm Miss Foster," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm the doctor from Sweetwater. Let's get you both into my wagon where it's warmer." "But Pa said to wait," the boy protested weakly. "And he was right to tell you that," Jane assured him. "But I'm here now and I can help. Your father would want you to be safe." After a moment's hesitation, the boy nodded. Jane carried the little girl first, then returned for the boy, setting them both in the wagon and wrapping them in the extra blankets she kept beneath her seat. "What's your name?" she asked, rubbing their small hands between hers. "I'm Thomas," the boy said. "This is my sister Lily." "Our pa is Mr. Garrett Lawson. We live at Willow Creek Ranch." Jane nodded. She knew of Willow Creek Ranch. It lay about a mile ahead if her bearings were correct. It had been established a few years back by a widower from Texas, though she'd never met the owner personally. Sweetwater was small, but as the only doctor for 20 miles, she kept too busy to socialize much beyond her patients. "We'll get you home," she promised, "and then we'll send help to find your father." The journey to Willow Creek was agonizingly slow. Jane kept checking the children for signs of frostbite or worse. The little girl had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign, while Thomas kept drifting to sleep despite Jane's attempts to keep him talking. Finally, the silhouette of a large ranch house emerged through the snow, a single light glowing in the window. Jane pulled up as close as she could to the porch and carried the children one by one to the door. Her knocks were answered by an elderly woman with a weathered face and eyes that widened in shock. "Good heavens, Thomas! Lily!" she exclaimed. "You know these children?" Jane asked as she carried Lily inside. "I'm Mrs. Abernathy, the housekeeper," the woman replied, already taking Thomas's coat. "Where's Mr. Lawson?" Jane quickly explained the situation as she laid Lily on the sofa near the fireplace. "We need to warm them gradually," she instructed, slipping into her role as doctor. "And someone needs to look for Mr. Lawson. The children said he was injured." Mrs. Abernathy nodded grimly. "The ranch hands are out with the cattle, moving them to the lower pasture before the worst of the storm. There's just me here." Jane didn't hesitate. "Then I'll go. Give me directions to where the sleigh tipped over and keep these children warm. Don't give them anything hot to drink, yet lukewarm only, and keep them awake if you can." The housekeeper began to protest, but Jane was already pulling her coat tighter. "I'm a doctor, Mrs. Abernathy. I can't leave an injured man out there to die." With rough directions and a borrowed lantern, Jane set out again into the blinding snow. She followed her own wagon tracks back to the overturned sleigh, then began to search in ever-widening circles, calling out, "Mr. Lawson, can you hear me?" The wind seemed to swallow her voice. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Her fingers and toes were going numb despite her thick gloves and boots. Just as despair began to set in, she spotted a dark shape slumped against a fence post. "Mr. Lawson," she called, rushing forward. The man didn't respond. As she knelt beside him, Jane could see blood had frozen on his temple. His pulse was faint but present, and his breathing shallow. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall. Even in unconsciousness, there was something commanding about his features: a strong jaw covered in dark beard stubble, a straight nose, and brows that seemed permanently furrowed. "Mr. Lawson, I've found your children," she said loudly, hoping to rouse him. "They're safe at your home. I'm Dr. Foster. I'm going to help you." The man's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes as gray as the winter sky. They focused on her for just a moment before closing again. Getting him onto her wagon was a Herculean task. Jane was strong for her size. Years of lifting patients and hauling her own supplies had built her strength, but Garrett Lawson was easily twice her weight. Eventually, through determination and the adrenaline of knowing a life depended on her, she managed to drag him to the wagon and, with a technique involving her medical bag as a step, heave him into the back. By the time they reached Willow Creek Ranch, Jane was exhausted and half frozen herself. 3 ranch hands had returned and helped carry their boss inside, laying him in his bedroom while Jane directed their efforts. "He has a concussion," she explained to Mrs. Abernathy, who hovered anxiously in the doorway, "and mild hypothermia. How are the children?" "Warming up nicely," the housekeeper replied. "Thomas is asking for his pa." Jane nodded. "Tell him his father will be fine but needs to rest. I'll come check on them as soon as I've treated Mr. Lawson." For the next 2 hours, Jane worked to raise Garrett's body temperature gradually while tending to the gash on his head. The wound wasn't as bad as the blood had made it appear, but the concussion worried her. She cleaned and stitched the cut, then wrapped his head with a clean bandage. As the evening wore on, the children were put to bed, the ranch hands retreated to their bunkhouse, and Mrs. Abernathy prepared a room for Jane. The storm outside had intensified, making travel impossible. "You'll stay the night, of course," Mrs. Abernathy insisted. "Mr. Lawson would insist, and it's not safe out there." Jane agreed, though she worried about her absence from town. She kept vigil by Garrett's bedside, checking his pulse regularly and making notes in her small medical journal. Near midnight, he began to stir. "Careful now," she said softly as his eyes opened. "You've had quite a day, Mr. Lawson." His gaze, clearer now, fixed on her face. "My children," he rasped. "Safe and sound, sleeping in their beds," she assured him. "I found them by your sleigh and brought them home." Relief washed over his features, followed by confusion. "Who are you?" "Jane Foster. I'm the doctor from Sweetwater." "A woman doctor?" he questioned, wincing as he tried to sit up. "Yes, a woman doctor," she replied evenly, pressing him gently back against the pillows. "And you're in no condition to move yet. You have a concussion and nearly froze to death out there." To her surprise, he didn't argue further. "The children, they weren't hurt, cold and frightened, but unharmed," Jane assured him. "Thomas is quite brave. He was protecting his sister when I found them." A ghost of a smile touched Garrett's lips. "He's like his mother that way." The mention of the children's mother sparked Jane's curiosity, but she kept her questions professional. "You should rest. I'll check on you again in 2 hours." Concussions require monitoring. Before she could stand, his hand caught her wrist. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "Thank you," he said simply, "for my children." Jane nodded, a strange warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the bedroom's hearth. "Rest, Mr. Lawson." The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape. Jane checked on her patient early, finding him awake and significantly improved, though still weak. She instructed him to remain in bed for at least another day, which earned her a scowl. "I have a ranch to run," Garrett protested. "And you have capable hands to run it for a day or two," she countered. "Unless you'd prefer to collapse in the snow again and leave your children truly orphaned this time." Her words were harsh but effective. The fight went out of him, replaced by a shadow of grief that made Jane regret her bluntness. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That was uncalled for." Garrett shook his head slightly. "No, you're right. I've been reckless. Yesterday proved that." He looked past her to the window. "Emma, my wife, died 3 years ago. Influenza. Sometimes I forget that the children have only me now." Jane's heart ached for him. "Children are resilient, Mr. Lawson, but they need you healthy." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas and Lily, who bounded into the room with the energy only children can muster after a trauma. They climbed onto their father's bed, careful of his bandaged head after a warning look from Jane. "Miss Jane saved us, Pa," Thomas exclaimed. "She's real strong, too. She carried Lily through the snow and gave us warm milk," Lily added, her little face serious. "But not too hot, 'cause that's dangerous when you're cold." Jane smiled at the girl's recitation of her medical advice. "That's right, Lily. You're a good listener." Garrett watched the interaction, something shifting in his expression. "It seems we owe Dr. Foster a great deal," he said to his children. "Perhaps you should help Mrs. Abernathy make her a special breakfast before she returns to town." The children nodded enthusiastically and scampered off, leaving Jane and Garrett alone again. "I don't want to impose," Jane began. "I should get back to Sweetwater." "Please," Garrett interrupted. "Stay for breakfast at least. The trails will still be difficult and your horses need rest too." Jane hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but I'll need to leave afterward. I have patients waiting." Breakfast was a lively affair. Despite her attempts to maintain professional distance, Jane found herself charmed by the Lawson family. Thomas regaled her with stories about his pony, while Lily insisted on sitting beside Jane at the table. Even Mrs. Abernathy seemed to have warmed to her presence, serving Jane extra portions of everything. Garrett joined them briefly, against Jane's medical advice, looking pale but determined. He said little, but his eyes often found Jane's across the table, filled with a gratitude that made her cheeks warm. When it was time for her to depart, the entire household came out to see her off. Garrett stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat despite the morning sun. "Dr. Foster," he called as she climbed onto her wagon. "I'd like to properly thank you. Perhaps you would join us for dinner sometime. When I'm fully recovered, of course," he added with a small smile. Jane found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the invitation. That would be nice, Mr. Lawson. As she drove away, Jane couldn't help glancing back at the tall figure on the porch, his children waving vigorously beside him. Something about the Lawson family had touched her in a way she hadn't expected. She told herself it was merely professional concern, but deep down, she knew it was something more. 3 weeks passed before Jane heard from the Lawsons again. Winter maintained its grip on the Wyoming territory, but the worst of the blizzards had passed, allowing travel between isolated homesteads and the small town of Sweetwater. Jane kept busy treating winter ailments, frostbite, coughs, and the occasional broken bone from falls on ice. She had just finished setting the arm of a young cowhand when Mrs. Abernathy appeared at her clinic door. "Mr. Lawson sends his regards," the housekeeper said formally, "and wishes to know if you might join the family for dinner this Sunday." Jane hesitated only briefly before accepting. "Please tell Mr. Lawson I would be delighted." Sunday arrived with clear skies and milder temperatures. Jane dressed with more care than usual, selecting a deep blue dress that her sister in Boston had sent for Christmas. She rarely had occasions to wear it, spending most days in practical skirts and shirtwaists that could withstand the rigors of her profession. The drive to Willow Creek Ranch was pleasant, the snow-covered landscape beautiful in the afternoon sunlight. As she approached, Jane saw Thomas and Lily watching from the porch, bundled against the cold. They waved excitedly when they spotted her wagon. "Miss Jane! Miss Jane!" they called in unison as she pulled up. Garrett appeared behind them, looking much improved from when she'd last seen him. The wound on his temple had healed to a thin red line, and color had returned to his face. He wore a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair combed neatly back. "Dr. Foster," he greeted her, extending a hand to help her down from the wagon. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, suddenly shy in his presence. His hand was warm around hers, strong and calloused from ranch work. The home looked different in daylight without the panic of the storm. It was well built and comfortable, with sturdy furniture and a few feminine touches that must have been Emma Lawson's influence, embroidered cushions and carefully placed wildflowers preserved in glass jars. Dinner was a roast with vegetables from the root cellar and fresh bread that Mrs. Abernathy had baked that morning. The children dominated the conversation, eager to tell Jane everything about their lives that they hadn't managed to share during their brief previous encounter. "Pa's teaching me to ride proper, not just on my pony," Thomas declared proudly. "He says by spring I can help with the cattle. If you mind your lessons," Garrett reminded him gently. "Reading's as important as riding." Jane smiled at this. "Your father's right. I wouldn't be a doctor if I hadn't studied hard." "Did you always want to be a doctor?" Garrett asked, seeming genuinely curious. Jane nodded. "Since I was about Thomas's age. My father was a doctor in Boston. I used to follow him on his rounds whenever he'd let me." She took a sip of water. "Not everyone approved of my choice, of course. Medical colleges rarely accept women." "How did you manage it?" Garrett asked. "Persistence," Jane replied with a small smile, "and my father's influence. He convinced a colleague at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania to consider my application." "Is that why you came west?" Lily asked, surprising the adults with her perceptiveness. "Because people didn't want a lady doctor." Jane considered the child's question carefully. "Partly," she admitted, "but also because doctors are needed more out here. In Boston, there are many doctors. In Wyoming territory, there are few." Garrett studied her with newfound respect. "It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind." "As you would know," Jane replied. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you came from Texas." A shadow crossed his face. "After Emma died, I couldn't stay. Too many memories." He glanced at his children, who had heard this story before and showed no reaction. "We came north for a fresh start." After dinner, Mrs. Abernathy took the children to prepare for bed, leaving Jane and Garrett alone in the sitting room. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something Jane couldn't quite name. "How is your head?" she asked finally, falling back on her medical training. "Healed," he replied. "Thanks to your care." Jane nodded, her eyes falling on a small framed photograph on the mantel, a pretty woman with Lily's delicate features smiling into the camera. "Your wife was beautiful." Garrett followed her gaze. "Yes," he said softly, "she was." After a moment he added, "I didn't think I could feel anything again after losing her. I've been cold inside, focused only on survival, on providing for the children." Jane turned to him, struck by his candor. "But when you found Thomas and Lily," he continued, "when you risked your life to find me, it woke something I thought was gone." Their eyes met, and Jane felt her heart quicken. "Mr. Lawson, Garrett," he corrected gently. "Please." "Garrett," she repeated, the name feeling intimate on her lips. "I was just doing what anyone would have done." He shook his head. "Not anyone, you." He stepped closer. "Jane, I'm not a man of many words, but I'd like to see you again, not as your patient, not out of obligation." Jane found herself nodding. "I'd like that too." That Sunday dinner became the first of many. Through the remaining winter months, Jane found reasons to visit Willow Creek Ranch, and Garrett found reasons to come to town. The children grew attached to her, especially Lily, who declared she wanted to be a lady doctor too someday. As spring thawed the frozen landscape, Jane's feelings for Garrett deepened. He was different from any man she'd known, straightforward yet gentle, strong yet vulnerable. She saw how tenderly he cared for his children, how he honored their memories of their mother while helping them build new ones. One April evening, as wildflowers began to dot the prairie, Garrett invited Jane to ride with him along the creek that gave the ranch its name. The air was fresh with spring promise, and new green grass pushed through the last patches of snow. "The children adore you," Garrett said as they let their horses drink from the burbling creek. "Thomas asked yesterday if you were going to be their new mother." Jane's breath caught. "What did you tell him?" Garrett turned to face her fully. "I said that would be entirely up to you." He dismounted and came to help her down, but didn't release her waist when her feet touched the ground. "Jane, I never expected to love again after Emma. I thought that part of me was gone forever." His gray eyes searched hers. "But you brought warmth back to me, to all of us. The children weren't the only ones playing alone in the cold that day. I was too, in my own way." Jane placed her hand against his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat. "Garrett, I love you," he said simply. "I want you to be part of our family, if you'll have us, all of us." Tears welled in Jane's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." His kiss was tender, a promise of the life they would build together. When they returned to the ranch, hand in hand, Thomas and Lily ran to meet them, somehow sensing the change in their relationship. Garrett lifted both children into his arms, and Jane wrapped her arms around all three of them, completing the circle. They were married in May, when the Wyoming prairie was alive with color. The ceremony was small, just the residents of Willow Creek Ranch and a few townsfolk from Sweetwater. Jane wore a cream-colored dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Garrett couldn't take his eyes off her. Thomas proudly carried the rings, while Lily scattered flower petals with great seriousness. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Jane as his children cheered. At the small reception afterward, Jane found a moment alone with her new husband on the porch of what was now her home. "Happy?" Garrett asked, his arm secure around her waist. Jane nodded, watching Thomas teach one of the young ranch hands a complicated hand game while Lily twirled in her dress, showing off for Mrs. Abernathy. More than I ever thought possible. Garrett pressed a kiss to her temple. That day in the blizzard, I thought I was going to lose everything. Instead, I found everything I didn't know I was missing. Jane turned in his arms, meeting his gaze. I came west to be a doctor to help people. I never expected to find a family. Are you still planning to practice? He asked. The ranch is far from town. I've been thinking about that, Jane admitted. I could set up a small clinic here for the ranch hands and neighboring homesteads, and still go into Sweetwater a few days a week. Garrett smiled. I think that's a fine idea. This territory needs good doctors, and you're the best I know. I'm the only one you know, she teased. The only one I need to know, he replied, pulling her close again. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A blizzard, 2 lost children, and a man who'd forgotten how to feel until she showed him that the warmth he sought had been within him all along, waiting to be rekindled. Thomas and Lily ran up to them, their faces flushed with excitement. Are you our mother now? Lily asked Jane directly. Jane knelt down to the child's level. I am, if you'd like me to be. I can never replace your first mother. She'll always be in your heart, but I promise to love you as if you were my own. Thomas nodded solemnly. Pa says we're lucky, 'cause some kids only get one mother, but we get 2. One watching from heaven and one here with us. Your father is a very wise man, Jane said, feeling Garrett's hand on her shoulder. And now, Garrett added, gathering all 3 into his embrace, we're a family, complete. As the years passed, the Lawson family flourished. Jane's clinic at Willow Creek became known throughout the county, and she trained several young women as nurses, including Lily when she was old enough. Thomas grew into a fine young man who eventually took over much of the ranch's operation, allowing Garrett to focus on breeding the horses he'd always loved. 2 more children joined their family, a boy and a girl who grew up knowing the story of how their parents met during a blizzard, and how a doctor with a brave heart brought warmth to a cowboy who'd been cold for too long. And on winter evenings, when the wind howled around the sturdy ranch house, Jane and Garrett would sit by the fire, surrounded by their children, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the love that kept them warm.